Hello, everyone, and welcome to Technical File Compilation for In Vitro Diagnostics, presented to you by GMED North America. My name is Sheena Bond. I'm a lead auditor for ISO 1345, ISO 9001, the Canadian Medical Device Regulations, the Medical Device Directives, and the In Vitro Diagnostics Directives. I am also the IVD specialist at GMED North America, assessing technical files and design dossiers for IVDs. During the course of this webinar, we will cover some basic content requirement of IVD technical files and design dossiers. Although the overall content is similar for most medical devices, there are unique requirements for IVDs, and we will spend a few minutes discussing those requirements. We will also touch on how we assess technical files as a notified body and some of the specific items we look for. In addition, we will also cover some of the more common mistakes we see either during the initial submission or the gathering of data prior to submission. We'll have about 10 minutes after the webinar to answer a few questions, so if you have any, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box that you see on your screen, and I will do the best that I can to answer as many as possible. We'll answer the rest probably in about a week or so. But please note that if your question pertains to your device or your technical file specifically, it's best to send us an email or give us a call with your question. Don't forget that notified bodies have a duty of confidentiality, so if you have a question that pertains to you specifically, I won't be able to bring it up during the broadcast. At the end of the presentation, there will be a slide with the GMED contact information for you to direct your questions. And just a quick housekeeping note, the sound works much better if you're able to call in with your phone instead of listening over the internet. So let's get started. The topic of this discussion is concerning the technical files and design dossier requirements within the scope of the current IVDD. This does not include the proposed regulatory changes to the directive. We have a separate webinar planned to discuss those proposed changes, and it's being presented by Sarah Steck, who is the Legal and Regulatory Manager at GMED North America. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on the current European Directive on IVD 9879 EC. The IVDD is supported by the Common Technical Specifications for In Vitro Diagnostics Medical Devices, harmonized standards, and various guidance documents such as the MedDev. Often you will hear technical documentation referred to as technical files or design dossiers. Although these are often used interchangeably, there is actually a difference between the two. Technical files are retained on the premises of the manufacturer or the authorized representative for potential review by competent authorities and notified bodies. At GMED, we review these as part of your on-site audit, unless there are major changes, of course, which require a review between on-site audits. Design dossiers are technical files that are sent to the notified body for an examination of the design according to Annex 3.6, Annex 4.4, or Annex 5. Keep in mind that manufacturers must maintain technical documentation for all medical devices, regardless of the device class. So what comprises a technical file? Technical documentation should contain the following sections: the device description, evidence of compliance to essential requirements, a full risk analysis, information about the chemical and biological safety of the device, relevant information concerning the suitability of packaging, qualification and performance evaluation data and stability data, instructions for use and all product labeling, a description of the manufacturing process, including the quality control activities, information on materials used and the manufacturing and release specifications, the QC testing requirements and acceptance criteria, and last, but usually included in the beginning of a technical file, is the Declaration of Conformity. When submitting design dossiers to a notified body, you don't have to include all of the documents that have already been subject to an ISO or CE audit by the notified body. Those documents, such as quality manuals, any low-level procedures, or work instructions, should have been reviewed on site. However, there are some exceptions that may need to be reviewed off-site, for example, the procedure for post-market surveillance. And then those particular documents will be requested during the review process. Okay, let's discuss the general device description. This is usually the first thing a reviewer looks at, since it will give us an general idea of the product under examination. This documentation should include the name of the device, reference numbers of the device, additional equipment required, for example, if your IVD is developed to run on a particular instrument, and also the microbiological state of the device if this is applicable. Variants of the device, description of the variants, and any corresponding reference numbers should also be included. Sizes or volumes of the device, and the number of tests in each kit should be documented as well. And the device class and justification according to Annex 2 of the IVDD. As part of the general description, the claimed use of the device should be included, including details on the diagnostic principle and classification of the product according to the GMDN code. So a quick note on the GMDN code, it's currently not mandatory, but it is strongly encouraged, as the medical device regulators in 65 countries are using the GMDN code to support patient safety, and they're actually beginning to require the use of GMDN codes in their medical device listings and approval processes. So this could be a blocking point for sale of your device and distribution of your device. So just keep that in mind. Continuing with claimed use, information on shelf life of the device should also be included, and classification in regards to the nature of the assay. So whether it's a screening assay, a confirmatory assay, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. The general description should also include information on non-viable material of animal or human origin. This should include any relevant details on the source of that material and any measures to protect personnel and measures to preserve the performance of the device. The next important component of technical documentation is evidence of compliance to the essential requirements. This will be your essential requirements checklist, including references to harmonized standards applied and the common technical specifications if applicable. So harmonized standards are the tools for presumption of conformity to the essential requirements of the directive. The checklist should include any standards that are identified and applied as part of design input. So keep in mind that it is not mandatory to use harmonized standards. However, if you do not use the relevant harmonized standards, you should include an explanation and justification of equivalency of any alternative methods being used. In cases where there are no harmonized standards, you can also use national or international standards that are evaluated with respect to the state of the art and devices and any general guidance documents. Standard operating procedures are also referenced in the Essential Requirements Checklist. However, this is not a requirement. Okay, risk analysis. Let's talk about risk management. When submitting your risk analysis, you should include a full risk management file. The risk management file should include identification of the device, the risk analysis, risk evaluation, and any control measures, production and post-production information. And I thought this picture was rather appropriate because when it comes to risk management, many organizations feel as if they are constantly jumping through hoops. And for that, we can thank, you guessed it, ISO 14971, revision 2012. So I decided to dedicate a slide to this standard alone because this is one of the most common nonconformities we're currently seeing in design dossiers and technical files. For any products sold in the EU, now this is not just manufacturers located in the EU, for products sold in the EU, risk analysis should be performed according to the ISO 14971 revision 2012. Now there's been a lot of confusion because the normative text of the standard actually didn't change. However, the annexes of the standard introduced major changes that truthfully have just been overlooked by a lot of medical device manufacturers. So if you're still having trouble understanding those changes, I provided links to both the GMED newsletter from March of 2013 that discusses those changes. And if you're lucky enough that your organization has not blocked YouTube, there is also a link to a webinar that was presented by GMED in May of 2013. Your risk analysis should address items including possible hazards and minimization of risk. Risk analysis should include any post-market surveillance experience, risks derived from complaint history, and risks from clinical experience. When performing risk analysis for diagnostics products, you must take into consideration all hazards which may influence test results, the safety of the patient, the safety of the end user, and any impact on the environment when disposing of the device. So, for example, disposal of products containing sodium azide in the EU requires special consideration. Risk analysis also should address any potential handling mistakes in case of self-test devices. Annex H of EN ISO 14971 lists potential hazards that should be considered when performing a risk analysis for an IVD. These items include, but are not limited to, within batch inhomogeneity, batch-to-batch inconsistency, the value of non-traceable calibrators, non-commutable calibrators, non-specificity, which is also referred to as interfering factors, sample or reagent carryover, measurement and precision, which is related to instruments, and stability failures, which could be failures during storage, transportation, or in-use failures. So, as we all know, IVDs can be extremely diverse. You have IVD examinations that are performed in a laboratory and reported to a physician who interprets the data and diagnoses, treats, or monitors their patients. We also have IVD examinations that are performed by patients who use the results to monitor and medicate his or her own condition. So because of the diversity of IVD medical devices, their intended use, and most importantly, their intended users, risk analysis can be somewhat complicated. And therefore, you'll see extremely different approaches than you would typically see with other types of medical devices. The next major section of the technical file should be information on chemical and biological safety. The material used in the product should be listed, included any relevant material safety data sheets, MSDS sheets. Characteristics of the basic material should also be included with information on handling of the material, the appropriate disposal of material, and information on biological safety, because as many of you know, IVDs contain biohazardous or potential biohazardous source materials. So if the device does contain tissues of animal or human origin or substances derived from such tissue, during the review, we look specifically for information on those products with regard to the origin of that material, also the conditions in which that material was collected, and any information on potential risks. So this section should actually include more specific detail than the chemical and biological safety information noted in the general description of the device. It's also important to include packaging information and any documentation or studies that support the suitability of packaging. IVDs are basically chemicals, so devices need to be stored in containers that will prevent degradation and not interfere with the chemical nature of the device. They need to be packaged in a way that protects the device, and when applicable, this would include evidence of leakage protection, evidence of transportation protection for physical handling, or for temperature and even humidity control. So, for example, in the case of lateral flow assays, humidity changes have a major impact on your device. Any evidence of photosensitivity protection, obviously light-sensitive devices are not going to be packaged in clear bottles, and any documentation on the validation of the packaging process should also be included. The technical documentation should have data supporting the claimed performance of the device. Performance data may include sensitivity of the device, specificity of the device, data supporting the limit of detection, or the ratio of false positives or false negatives to true positives or true negatives. Performance evaluation may also be from market experience of the same device or similar devices. This is particularly relevant when it comes to well-established devices that have been on the market for a while. Information from scientific literature can also be used to support device performance. And for List A products undergoing design examination, this is where the common technical specifications enter the process. Performance and quality control testing must meet common technical specifications whenever these are available for a product. The common technical specifications establish the appropriate performance evaluation and reevaluation criteria, batch release criteria, Reference methods and reference materials for assessment of IVDs included in Annex 2, List A of the directive. The CTS covers performance evaluation of products for HIV, HTLV, and hepatitis B, C, and D. There are also additional requirements for nucleic acid amplification techniques. Specifications are established for release testing of reagents for markers of HIV infection, HTLV, and hepatitis B, C, and D. Specifications are established for performance evaluation for products determining the blood group antigen, and also the release testing of products for determining the blood group antigen. And finally, specifications for variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease assays for blood screening were added as part of the latest common decision. Data corresponding to the common technical specifications is often submitted in the form of a CTS chart or table as a summary, and followed by the comprehensive testing data. If your device is intended for self-testing, it is critical to include Layman studies or end-user studies in your performance evaluation data. This is described in Annex 1, B7 of the directive. The critical aspects of Layman studies are that they must, of course, be performed by laymen. They must ensure the device is easy to use by the intended lay user at all stages of the procedure. And they must be evaluated in an environment similar to that intended in practice. Layman studies should be performed with the device and instructions as they are intended to be provided to market. Stability studies must be included in the technical documentation to support the claimed shelf life of the product. This should not only include the shelf life from date of manufacture, but also the shelf life once the product has been opened. It must be proven that the performance and the microbiological state of the whole kit is still suitable at the end of shelf life. Stability also must take into consideration any specified transport or storage conditions. For instance, in the case of an assay run on instruments, this would include onboard storage of the product if it's included in the product claim. Accelerated studies at increased temperatures may be acceptable, but these should be confirmed by real-time stability studies. For stability studies, state-of-the-art is at least 3 batches. The labeling of the product is considered not only the physical labels on the product, but any information that is included with the product, such as instructions for use. In the case of IVDs, the material safety data sheet may also be included with the labeling if not addressed someplace else in the file. When including labels in technical documentation, you must provide all relevant labels. Reagent labels, inner cartons, outer cartons, all should be included. Of course, the instructions for use must be provided to the end user according to the European language requirements. During the review, we will check to make sure that there are provisions to provide the IFU in the language of the country the product is being sold in, and this can be the actual translated IFU or a translation procedure with requirement to provide instructions in the appropriate language. In the latter case, it's perfectly acceptable to include the IFU in English only. For self-test devices, it's important to remember that the instructions for use have to be understandable by laymen and that the symbols have to be easily recognized. The description of the manufacturing process is another section of the technical documentation that is often incomplete. There is a lot of information provided in this section, and we actually do review it all. This should include all of the design information, including any drawings, diagrams of components, sub-assemblies or circuits in the case of IVD instruments, documentation on design verification and validation, and this is usually in the form of design review meetings, documentation on the packaging validation, a comprehensive description of the product. If this has been included in another section, it's not necessarily repeated. And keep in mind, all of the information included in this presentation is concerning general content, not necessarily a table of content. So as long as your organization has identified and included the core information, the order is really up to you. The manufacturing process should also include information on the final product release criteria. Continuing with the description of the manufacturing process are flowcharts of the process with descriptions of any in-process testing and controls. description of the manufacturing methods, description of the manufacturing equipment, description of the manufacturing environment. So if you have specifications for the manufacturing environment, either a clean room or controlled environment area, that information, the specification, class, or specific requirements of those areas should also be included. Information on the manufacturing sites and the quality management certification of subcontractors, if those are applicable, and any identification of raw materials. So this next slide is actually a table taken right out of our report so that you can have an idea of how much detail we include in a document when we're documenting the product manufacturing. As you can see from the table, we assess every stage of the manufacturing process from design to release to determine the relevant parties involved. For the final product release, this should include the final QC testing information, including the batch release criteria. In the case of List A products, this should include the process data evaluated for your internal batch release, the testing protocols of your company for the batch, including the number of samples being studied, any further associated verification or validation data. For List A products, the requirements for batch release are referenced in the Common Technical Specification. This last section on the content of technical documentation, as I mentioned before, is often included in the beginning because we're able to assess quite a bit of the basic information required for the technical documentation assessment from this very important piece of paper. The Declaration of Conformity should contain the following information: manufacturing name and address, the name and address of the European representative, your product information, the name, the type, and or model, the classification of the product, list A or B according to Annex 2 or self-test IVD, conformity assessment route, the annex applied, a list of harmonized standards for which the documented evidence for compliance can be provided, notified body information, name, address, and identification number, the EC certificate number. Of course, we won't have this information for an initial assessment, but it should be added later. And, of course, as mentioned before, the GMDN codes. Again, these are not mandatory, but are the current trend. The GMDN codes are used in the UDMED database that was mentioned previously. The European Economic Area requests the use of GMDN codes to support the conformity assessment process required for CE marking. And now in the U.S., the FDA has introduced the use of GMDN codes as part of their UDI rule. The start of CE marking information, date, lot number, or serial number of first CE marking, and of course the signature of the responsible party for the Declaration of Conformity. In setting up their internal methodologies for assessing technical files, notified bodies rely on a few guidelines. Notified bodies also look at technical files at different times. Specifically for LNA-GMED, we assess the technical file using a sampling method during our on-site audits for devices that do not require design examination. For devices that do require design examination, we look at the whole file in our offices cover to cover. And regardless of which notified body is assessing your technical documentation and logistically how they do it, we are all looking for essentially the same thing: evidence of conformity to the essential requirements. So make sure your technical file speaks to how your device conforms to the essential requirements. Finally, let's examine some common mistakes that are typically seen during the review of technical files. First, we receive incomplete files all the time, and this is potentially the most costly mistake manufacturers can make. Having to request additional information and set up time for additional reviews can add significant amounts of time to your review. GMED provides a list of documents to be included in the assessment. However, when in doubt, you can always contact your notified body representative. In our case, that would be your certification project manager. Not using the latest risk management standards. This has come up so frequently that I decided to dedicate a whole slide to this particular issue. If your products are sold in the EU and you claim ISO 14971 for risk management, You must assess the changes implemented by the EN ISO 14971-2012. So please revisit slide 12 for links with more information about the changes to the risk management standard. Missing proprietary information. This is often the case with design and manufacturing, the design and manufacturing section specifically. Understandably, manufacturers are protective of their proprietary data. However, keep in mind that notified bodies follow strict confidentiality rules and under no circumstances will share your information. Missing subcontractor information. This makes it difficult to verify the certification of subcontractors. In the cases where it's discovered that a major subcontractor is not appropriately certified to ISO 1345, notified bodies must plan an on-site audit of that subcontractor. So it's very important to include this information to avoid or to plan any additional required audit. Lack of structure or organization for the documents in the technical file. Again, this can be very time-consuming for the reviewer and for the manufacturer, constantly having to locate specific data for the reviewer. And I know personally speaking, as a design dossier reviewer, nothing makes me happier than a proper table of contents. No gap analysis for changes or renewals. When a change takes place, we don't necessarily have to re-review the whole file when an appropriate gap analysis is provided. However, unless the changes are highlighted, a full review is really the only way for us to assess those changes. The same with renewals. Over the course of 5 years validity of a design examination certificate, there should have been many changes and updates, so those should be summarized in your submission. Self-test. No layman or end-user studies are not including the appropriate studies. So, for example, a layperson study is not performed using the relevant IFUs. Incomplete documents, missing signatures. Just like with an on-site audit, you wouldn't present documents to an auditor that have not been signed. And photocopies are perfectly acceptable and preferred. Please do not send us your originals. Translations and labeling for intended countries. This is not necessarily the IFU, which we discussed earlier, but the actual product label. So if you intend to sell a product in France, you may expect to see the relevant instructions on the label in French or as symbols. Missing data analysis. And post-market data is the biggest culprit here. For CE marked products, post-market data should include the countries the products have been sold in, the number of kits sold in the EU, and the relevant complaint, recalls, and incident data. So not addressing changes in the general accepted state of the art. So this would be your changes in pathogens, changes in markers, changes in applicable standards, and identification of emerging dangers considering these changes. And this is critical to establish product that is undergoing renewal. Okay. Well, we have reached the end of our presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you found this webinar on technical file compilation for IVD products helpful. Like I said before, I will be here for another 10 minutes or so to answer some of your questions that were submitted during the webinar or that you submit right now. And if I don't get to your question today, please feel free to contact us. And with that, let's go on to the questions. Thank you all very much.